It was October of the year 1216, and within the damp, stone walls of Newark Castle, the air was thick with more than the scent of wood smoke. It carried with it the unmistakable stench of disease and decay. Flickering torchlight cast shadows that danced across the chamber, where a once mighty monarch lay broken on a sweat-soaked bed of straw and linen. His groans echoed off the vaulted ceiling, his body twisting and convulsing in fits of unbearable agony. This was no peasant, no common soldier discarded by fate. This was John, King of England, Lord of Ireland, Duke of Normandy and Aquitaine, Count of Anjou, brother to Richard the Lionheart, son of Henry II, a man who had once held in his hands the fate of kingdoms. Yet in this moment, stripped of power and dignity, he was little more than a carcass rotting in advance of its death. History had not prepared him for a glorious end, sword in hand on the battlefield, surrounded by banners and the loyalty of his knights. Nor was he to pass away gently, attended by courtiers whispering prayers for his soul. Instead, John met his final hours consumed by filth and fire from within. The cause was dysentery, what chroniclers of the age called the bloody flux. But the phrase hardly captures the horror of it. This was no minor stomach illness. It was a violent, unrelenting affliction that shredded the lining of the intestines and left its victims writhing in fever, delirium, and waves of explosive, bloody diarrhea. Contemporary accounts claimed it seemed as though the king's very insides were bursting out of him. Here lay the ruler of England, not cloaked in majesty, but drowning in humiliation. Every spasm was a reminder that nature itself showed no mercy, not even to those who claimed divine right to rule. The flickering flames revealed a face slick with sweat, eyes rolling back in fevered torment. His breath came in ragged gasps, and his moans were half human, half animal. Sounds of a man being torn apart by forces he could neither command nor resist. To those who chronicled his passing, it was a death richly deserved. John, the treacherous, cruel and grasping monarch, had left a trail of broken promises, betrayals and brutalities. Now, as his body betrayed him in the most degrading way imaginable, many would see divine justice at work. The King of England, once master of millions, was reduced to nothing more than a man drowning in his own corruption. His end was not a blaze of glory but an eruption of filth, a fitting prelude to how history would remember him, as the tyrant who lost everything, even his dignity, in the hour of death. From the very moment of his birth, John's destiny seemed cursed. He was the youngest of Henry II's 4 surviving sons, and by the time he entered the world, every estate, every rich inheritance, had already been promised to his elder brothers. While Henry's other sons were destined for crowns, duchies, and vast dominions, John was left with nothing. His father, with the cutting wit of a monarch who knew the cruel weight of politics, bestowed upon him a nickname that would haunt him forever: John Lackland. The title was no jest, it was prophecy. A prince without land, a son without legacy. And so from boyhood, John carried within him a hunger that gnawed at his very bones, the relentless desire for power he could never truly claim. When his brother Richard, the famed Lionheart, departed on the Third Crusade, John's moment seemed to arrive. While Richard marched toward glory in the Holy Land, John stayed in England, scheming in the shadows. He whispered rumors into the ears of nobles that Richard had fallen, that the great Lionheart was dead. He aligned himself with Richard's enemies, French and domestic alike, preparing to seize a crown that was not his. In this theater of treachery, John revealed his true nature. He was not a warrior like Richard, nor a statesman like his father. He was an opportunist, a vulture circling over the crown, waiting for blood to be spilled so he might feast on the remains. His ambition was so naked, so desperate, that when Richard was captured and held prisoner on his return journey, John moved not to rescue his brother, but to keep him in chains. He schemed to delay ransom payments, to sabotage negotiations, hoping Richard would rot in a foreign dungeon while John claimed the throne of England for himself. But fortune, that fickle mistress, betrayed him. Richard returned, very much alive, and John's cowardice and plotting were laid bare. The Lionheart could have executed his brother, could have branded him forever a traitor. Instead, Richard, perhaps amused at his pathetic ambition, chose forgiveness. John was forced back into the shadows, his hunger unsated, his humiliation complete. Yet treachery was in his marrow. The name Lackland was not just an insult but a wound that festered. John would never forget it, never forgive it. And when fate finally handed him the crown in 1199, after Richard's death by a crossbow bolt in France, John seized it with both hands. But his past had already written his future. For a man born with nothing, his reign would prove he was capable of losing everything. In 1199, fate at last delivered John what he had hungered for all his life. His brother, Richard the Lionheart, died from a crossbow wound in France, and John, the youngest son once mocked as Lackland, placed the crown of England upon his brow. At last, the outcast prince had become a king. But the crown that seemed to vindicate him would soon reveal his utter unworthiness. For the weight of kingship demands more than ambition. It demands strength, strategy, and the loyalty of men. These were qualities Richard had embodied in abundance, but John possessed none of them. Where Richard had led armies with the ferocity of a crusader knight, John faltered and hesitated. Where Richard had inspired loyalty, John sowed distrust. His reign began not with triumph, but with a slow cascade of humiliations that would stain his legacy forever. The greatest of these humiliations came at the hands of King Philip II of France, a master strategist and one of the most formidable rulers of the age. Against Philip's cunning, John proved inept. Time and again he marched his armies to war, and time and again he was forced into retreat. Soldiers who once looked to their king for courage now whispered bitterly in their camps, mocking him as John Softsword. By 1204, the damage was irreparable. Normandy, the ancestral home of the English kings since William the Conqueror, was lost. Along with it went Anjou, Maine, and Tyrant, vast territories that had once made the Angevin dynasty the most powerful in Europe. In a matter of years, John had squandered his father's empire, watching as centuries of conquest dissolved like sand through his fingers. The chroniclers of the age recorded not the valor of a warrior king, but the pitiful image of a monarch fleeing before his enemies. He was mocked, despised, and ridiculed not only abroad but at home. England's nobility, once proud of their continental holdings, seethed at the shame their king had brought them. For every failure in battle, John turned his frustration upon his own people, taxing them mercilessly to fund campaigns destined for disaster. But the deeper wound was not just territorial, it was personal. To lose Normandy was to sever England from its roots, to strip away the very foundation of the Plantagenet legacy. John, once called Lackland, had gained a crown only to preside over the collapse of everything it represented. The image of John Softsword would endure, a king who could not fight, who could not lead, who could not even hold on to the soil of his ancestors. A king whose crown was less a symbol of power than a mocking reminder of everything he had lost. If King John's defeats on the battlefield had disgraced him abroad, his response at home sealed his reputation as one of the most reviled monarchs in English history. Humiliated in war, he turned inward upon his own kingdom with a financial savagery that seemed to have no limits. To refill his coffers, to fund the hopeless wars he had already lost, John bled England dry. Inheritance taxes, income taxes, levies on land, tariffs on trade, he invented them all or pushed them to extremes no king before him had dared. Most notorious was his abuse of scutage, a tax that allowed knights to pay money instead of military service. Where his predecessors had used it sparingly, John demanded it again and again, 11 times in a reign of just 17 years. The weight of his greed fell on every knight, every noble, every manor. England was not merely governed under John. It was extorted. But John's cruelty was not only measured in coin. He wielded terror as a weapon. Those who crossed him found not just their wealth seized but their very families threatened. It was John's custom to take the children of noblemen as hostages, living guarantees of obedience. These boys and girls, some scarcely old enough to speak, were locked away in cold stone cells to remind their fathers of the king's reach. The most horrifying tale of his tyranny came with Matilda de Braos, the wife of a baron who had once served him loyally. When Matilda dared to speak aloud what others only whispered, that John had murdered his own young nephew, Arthur of Brittany, a potential rival to the throne, the king's vengeance was swift and merciless. She and her eldest son were dragged from their lands and thrown into the dungeons of Windsor Castle. The cell was sealed behind them, and John's jailers left only a pitiful ration, a sheath of oats and a strip of raw bacon. Then the door was closed, and silence reigned. 11 days later, when the guards finally opened the chamber, the scene inside was one of horror. Both mother and son lay dead. The boy had perished first. In the agony of her starvation, Matilda had been reduced to madness. The chroniclers wrote with grim fascination that she had gnawed at the cheeks of her own dead child before death claimed her. This was the justice of King John, a warning carved not in words, but in starvation and terror. To defy him was not only to risk your life, it was to risk the unthinkable destruction of your family. Under John's reign, England was a kingdom ruled not by law or honor, but by fear. King John's cruelty was not confined to his barons and subjects. In his arrogance, he dared to challenge the very authority of the Church itself. At the dawn of the 13th century, no power on earth rivaled that of Pope Innocent III, a man who bent kings and emperors to his will. Yet John, in his stubbornness, refused to yield. The quarrel began over the appointment of the Archbishop of Canterbury, the most sacred and powerful seat in the English Church. When Innocent nominated his candidate, John rejected him outright, insisting on his own choice. What followed was not merely a dispute, it was a declaration of war against Christendom. John struck first, seizing church lands, confiscating revenues, and treating sacred property as if it were spoils of conquest. Monasteries and cathedrals fell silent as their wealth was carried off to fuel the king's greed. Priests, bishops, and monks found themselves harassed, fined, or exiled. England, under John's hand, was at war with God. The Pope's response was swift and devastating. In 1208, Innocent III issued an interdict over the entire kingdom. It was the medieval equivalent of spiritual annihilation. Suddenly, the bells of every church across England went silent. The doors of parish churches were locked. Altars remained cold and unused. There was no mass, no confessions, no marriages blessed, no Christian burials for the dead. For 6 long years, the people of England lived in a state of spiritual lockdown, cut off from the rituals that gave them comfort and meaning. For ordinary men and women, the horror was indescribable. Babies were denied baptism. Lovers could not marry before God. The dying were buried in unhallowed ground, without the last rites of the church. The land itself seemed cursed, its people abandoned. Whispers spread that their king had brought God's wrath upon them. And then, in 1209, came the final blow. Pope Innocent excommunicated John himself. In one stroke, the King of England was transformed into a pariah in the Christian world, an outlaw not just among men, but before God. Chroniclers wrote that John was damned to hell, and his enemies rejoiced. Yet John remained defiant. He continued to squeeze his kingdom, to demand gold and obedience, even as the people grew to loathe him. To his barons, he was a tyrant. To the church, he was a heretic. To his people, he was the man who had chained their souls in darkness. By his own arrogance, John had achieved the impossible. He united nearly every heart in England against him. Not just nobles, not just priests, but the common folk, who saw in their suffering the mark of a king abandoned by heaven itself. By 1215, King John stood utterly alone. His barons despised him, the church mistrusted him, and the common people groaned beneath his greed. Betrayed by fortune, abandoned by allies, and hated by nearly every corner of his realm, he faced the inevitable: rebellion. The barons had risen, swords drawn not only against their king but against the very tyranny he embodied. They marched on London, forcing John into a corner from which there was no escape. And so, on the 15th of June, 1215, In a meadow at Runnymede by the River Thames, the confrontation reached its climax. There, beneath a canopy of banners, John was forced to face his enemies. The barons presented him with a parchment, a list of demands, a charter of liberties, that would later echo through history as the Magna Carta. Its clauses cut directly into the heart of John's power. The king was not above the law. No free man could be imprisoned without trial by his peers. Taxation could not be imposed without consent. Even weights and measures were to be standardized to restrain royal corruption. To the barons, it was victory, the taming of a tyrant. To John, it was humiliation, the shattering of his sacred right to rule unchallenged. His hand trembled as he affixed his royal seal to the document, but in his heart, he considered it no more binding than chains placed upon him by rebels. John had no intention of honoring Magna Carta. To him, it was an oath extorted under duress, and thus void in the eyes of God. In secret, he reached out to his old enemy turned ally, Pope Innocent III, to whom he had earlier surrendered England as a papal fief. With oily words, he complained that he had been forced into shameful submission. The Pope obliged. Within weeks, Innocent issued a papal bull declaring Magna Carta null and void of all validity forever. The chains were broken, or so John believed, but his triumph was short-lived. When word spread that the king had betrayed them, the barons erupted in fury. They had thought they had caged the tyrant, but instead, he had slipped free and unleashed his vengeance with papal blessing. For the nobility, this was not merely treachery. It was war. Thus began the First Barons' War. England was plunged into civil conflict, its soil drenched once again in blood, and at the heart of it all stood John, defiant, hated, and doomed, fighting not only his barons but the very tide of history that was rising against him. England was collapsing into chaos. The barons' revolt, ignited by John's treachery, spread like wildfire across the realm. But this was no longer simply rebellion, it was revolution. The nobles, exhausted by tyranny and betrayal, took a step so shocking it reverberated across Europe. They offered the crown of England to a foreigner. That foreigner was Prince Louis of France, son of King Philip II. In May 1216, Louis crossed the Channel, landing with his army at Kent. To John's horror, he was not met with resistance, but with open arms. London itself welcomed him as a liberator. The bells of the city rang out, not for their king, but for a French prince come to claim the throne. John became a fugitive in his own kingdom. Once the ruler of England, Ireland, and vast lands in France, he now found himself scrambling from castle to castle, desperately clinging to what power remained. His enemies closed in from every side. Rebellious barons in the heart of England, and French forces advancing from the south. It was in this desperate flight that John's reign reached its most infamous humiliation. In October of 1216, while moving his forces through the treacherous marshlands of the Wash in East Anglia, he attempted a perilous crossing at low tide. The king and his men managed to pass, but his baggage train, laden with the wealth of the crown, was not so fortunate. The wagons creaked and groaned across the mudflats, carrying gold, jewels, priceless relics, and the sacred crown of Alfred the Great, symbol of England's royal lineage. But the sea is merciless. As the tide rushed back in, waves swallowed the baggage train whole. Horses screamed as they were dragged into quicksand. Wagons overturned. Guards were swept away. In an instant, the treasures of England were gone, drowned beneath churning black waters. Chroniclers would later write that none of it was ever recovered. The jewels, the gold, the crown itself, all lost forever. It was more than a disaster of wealth. It was a perfect, brutal metaphor for John's reign. Everything he had stolen, hoarded, and abused, swallowed by the tide, beyond his grasp, beyond redemption. When news spread of the catastrophe, it seemed as if the land itself had risen against its king. To his enemies it was divine justice, to his supporters it was despair, and to John himself it was ruin. The king who had once been mocked as Lackland had now, at last, lost everything. Not just his lands, not just his crown jewels, but the very foundation of his authority. A throne that once seemed unshakable now trembled, ready to collapse into the sea with him. By the autumn of 1216, King John was a hunted man, hounded by rebels, cornered by the French, and betrayed by fate itself. Exhausted, broken in spirit, and desperate for comfort, he sought refuge at Swineshead Abbey, a quiet monastery amid the marshes of Lincolnshire. There, in a rare moment of respite, he abandoned caution and indulged himself in what would prove to be his final feast. The chroniclers differ on the details of that fateful meal. Some say he gorged himself on peaches, their sweetness masking the rot festering within his body. Others claim it was pears, or perhaps a newly pressed cider, raw and unfermented, that he drank in reckless excess. Whatever the truth, for a man already weakened by stress, hunger, and ceaseless travel, it was poison. His body, ravaged by years of strain, could not bear such indulgence. That night the sickness began. At first it was a fever, burning hot, his skin slick with sweat, his breath shallow and ragged. Then came the cramps, sharp knives twisting deep within his gut. But the worst was yet to come. John had fallen victim to the dreaded scourge of the medieval world: dysentery. This was not some passing stomach upset. Dysentery was a brutal killer, its attacks violent and relentless. The king's body convulsed as the infection shredded the lining of his intestines. He was gripped by waves of explosive diarrhea, streaked with blood and mucus, as his strength drained away with every spasm. Dehydration tightened its grip, his lips cracked, his eyes hollowed, his voice reduced to groans and delirious mutterings. Witnesses would later record that it was as though his very insides were tearing themselves apart. The mighty ruler of England, once feared by his barons and despised across Europe, was reduced to little more than a shivering wretch, fouling himself in agony on a monastery floor. And yet, there was a cruel symbolism in it. John, who had devoured his kingdom with taxes and extortion, now devoured himself from within. A man who had left behind a trail of betrayal, cruelty, and ruin was now betrayed by his own body, undone by his own appetite. By morning, the king could no longer rise from his bed. Too weak to ride, too frail even to stand, he would have to be carried on a litter for the remainder of his doomed journey. His final campaign was not against the barons or the French, but against the merciless torment raging inside his own flesh. The tyrant's end had begun, and there would be no escape. By mid-October 1216, King John was no longer a ruler but a ruin of a man. His body, ravaged by fever and dysentery, had betrayed him utterly. Too weak even to sit upright on horseback, he was forced into the humiliation of being carried in a rough wooden litter, borne on the shoulders of his men like some broken relic. The road itself became an instrument of torture. Every rut, every stone, every jolt of the wheels sent knives of agony tearing through his stomach. Once, he had commanded armies across battlefields. Now, the mere movement of a cart reduced him to pitiful groans. His attendants, hardened soldiers and monks alike, could do nothing but watch in grim silence as their king writhed in filth and misery. The journey was long and merciless. Villagers along the way saw the procession pass, but they did not cheer. They did not kneel. Instead, they watched in silence or whispered behind their hands. For here was no majestic sovereign, no man anointed by God, but a hollowed figure shuddering with disease, fouling himself, leaving behind a trail as shameful as it was literal. The stink of his illness clung to the very air, as if the land itself recoiled from him. Chroniclers would later write with almost cruel satisfaction about this march of degradation. The mighty king who had once extorted gold and blood from his people now traveled like a prisoner of his own flesh, powerless, disgraced. Even nature seemed to mock him. Cold winds bit at his fevered skin, autumn rains turned the roads to mud, and crows circled above as if awaiting the carrion soon to come. His men tried to keep pace, urging the litter forward toward safety, but there was no safety to be found. By the time the procession neared Newark Castle on the night of October 16th, John was barely conscious. His face was gaunt, his lips cracked, his once sharp eyes glazed with delirium. His voice, once commanding enough to bend nobles and bishops to his will, was now reduced to faint mutters. Confessions, curses, or cries for mercy, no one could say. When at last they reached the looming walls of Newark, the king was carried inside not as a sovereign entering his stronghold, but as a dying man brought to his deathbed. The shadow of the end had already fallen upon him. Within those damp stone halls, the final act of King John's wretched life would be played out. A monarch's last journey, reduced to agony, disgrace, and the bitter taste of divine retribution. On the night of October 18, 1216, King John of England drew his final breath within the damp stone walls of Newark Castle. His end was no peaceful passing. He died as he had lived, in agony, in disgrace, abandoned by all but a handful of attendants. Chroniclers, who had long despised him, wrote of his death with barely concealed satisfaction. To them, it was divine justice, the long-awaited judgment of God upon a man who had betrayed, extorted, and brutalized his kingdom. They described him writhing in torment, his body consumed by fever and dysentery, his insides torn apart by the very sickness that stripped him of dignity. The mighty monarch who had once demanded obedience through fear left this world helpless, filthy, and alone. Yet in this final humiliation, something extraordinary occurred. The death of the tyrant became the salvation of the realm. With John gone, the rebellion that had torn England apart suddenly lost its focus. The barons, who had sworn never again to trust their king, found themselves facing a very different figure on the throne, a child. John's heir was his son, Henry III, only 9 years old. Too young to be despised, too innocent to be blamed, the boy became a vessel of hope. He was crowned hastily at Gloucester, guided by the steady hand of William Marshal, the greatest knight of his age and one of the few men who had remained loyal even in John's darkest days. Marshal, acting as regent, knew exactly what had to be done. To win back the barons, he reissued the Magna Carta. Stripped of some of its more radical demands, it nevertheless kept its heart. The principle that the king was not above the law, that his power must be bound and limited. What had once been forced upon John in fury was now willingly upheld in the name of stability. And so, in the wake of one man's wretched death, the seeds of liberty were planted. The Magna Carta would be reaffirmed, reinterpreted, and reissued in the centuries to come. Its words would echo far beyond England, influencing the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, and even the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. John Lackland, the king who lost everything, lands, treasure, loyalty, dignity, unwittingly left behind the greatest legacy of all, a symbol of freedom that outlived him by centuries. His reign was a catalogue of failure. His death was pitiful, but his unintended gift reshaped the destiny of nations. In the end, the tyrant's agony became the world's liberty.